great. Thanks a lot. Matthew Lee, Intercity Press, on behalf of the Free UN Coalition for Access. Thanks a lot for doing this briefing. I wanted to ask, I guess, in terms of applying the principle to specific cases, I wanted to ask about what you could say about one case that the Secretary General did mention, South Sudan, and the idea that, I mean, it's been on the Council's agenda, there have been many meetings, seems to be a lot of deference to regional organizations on it. At what point do you think that deference either undermines the principle? And also Burundi, I know that Mr. Dieng, you've gone there and you've spoken about it, I guess, as maybe in terms of your other role of genocide. Do you see that as a case of responsibility of protect? And if so, what do you think the UN system should be doing about it?
Well, let me say that regarding South Sudan, we encourage the Security Council to adopt measures against those violations or undermining the recently signed peace agreement and lend its full political weight to ensuring implementation of this agreement. You may have seen the op-ed I recently published expressing really my anger the way this crisis has been dealt with so far and the lack of accountability for the atrocity crimes which have been committed in South Sudan. And in that regard, we have been calling also for the release to the public of the African Union Peace and Security Council. As you may know, they have set this commission of inquiry led by former President Obasanjo, and this has to be released publicly. I think it is extremely important. But we have to realize that despite the recent signing of this peace agreement, we unfortunately we are seeing that the forces allied to the two main parties to the conflict in South Sudan, I mean Salva Kiir and Riek Machar, continue to commit serious violations of human rights. And I think in that regard, it is important that really further action be taken, because we are facing these violations of human rights, violation of international humanitarian law, which could constitute definitely atrocity crimes. And for that reason, I think Jennifer would certainly be in agreement that there is a room on this issue when it comes to R2P. Definitely. And on Burundi, of course, we are continuing to follow very closely the situation. And although so far this crisis is a political one, but we have to be careful that political actors on both sides plays identity, plays ethnicity, and that could have really serious consequences. And that is why we cannot but strongly encourage that dialogue really resume between the two parties, and that really a solution be found to prevent further escalation of the violence. I think it is time that they get together. I mean, of course, we follow these recent days the tour made by both the Speaker of the Parliament and the first Vice President. I think they were even in New York. But that is not enough. It is important that the new government, that President Nkurunziza, be very inclusive, make sure also, and most importantly, that the Arusha Accord remain intact. I think nothing should be more serious than touching on the Arusha Accord. But for that, it is important that they get together around the table.
The only other thing I'd add on Burundi is that I think it's an instance which demonstrates, from the perspective of responsibility to protect, that you need to bring many different types of measures to bear. And so in our joint office, which has the mandate for also bringing to attention those situations which we think might be at risk of crisis, one wants to be able to recommend action at an earlier stage. And so preventive diplomacy in this case, as in other cases, is a very important tool to use. And as we know from the recent Peace Operations Review Panel report, there needs to be a lot more investment in those types of mechanisms. Peace operations have to be understood very broadly as not just including peacekeepers, but also diplomats, mediators, those who can engage in preventive diplomacy.
I thought it might be asked, but I don't. I've been following the debate. I haven't heard Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba. I haven't heard some of those who question whether the concept has actually been approved by the GA or there was some kind of sleight of hand. So I wanted to actually, I guess, ask you. I don't know if you're going to respond at the end of it, but what do you say to that argument that says that despite the multiple citations listed, that somehow the concept was kind of slipped through, and that there's a problem with the budgeting of it through the Fifth Committee? I guess I just wonder, are they entirely wrong? And I wanted to ask you about the case of Sri Lanka. You'd said, Mr. Welsh, that you think that the current Secretary General has been fully committed to this throughout. Some say that after what happened in Sri Lanka, there was this commitment to rights up front. Was that a shift? How would you put the UN's, what some say, failure in the case of Sri Lanka to apply these principles? How has it animated the debate and implementation since? Thanks.
On your first point, I think you'll hear from Venezuela and Cuba. I'm sorry, I don't know if Nicaragua was on the speaker's list, but I know that Venezuela and Cuba is this afternoon. Both this year and in previous years, we've done consultations with regional groupings. And so I've met with the Cubans and Venezuelans over the last couple of years, and I'm aware of their concerns. And I think one of the most important things for me in this particular role to be constantly aware of is that, there are concerns about responsibility to protect. And I don't take the view that these are always politically motivated, that they're disingenuous. They're often based on genuinely deep concerns about different aspects. In the case of both Venezuela and Cuba, they express concerns usually about measures under the third pillar. And those measures specifically related to the use of military force. And they worry, the concern that they express is that the principle may be abused. And it's a relevant concern. It's a concern that has to be taken into consideration. And it's why I think member states in 2005, when they endorsed the principle, made it very clear that they wanted any authorization of military means to be through the Security Council on a case-by-case basis, so that there would always be a collective decision that would have to be reached. And of course, Venezuela's been on the council, so it's been privy to this. In terms of whether there's support, demonstrable support for the office and for the concept, I think there was the resolution in 2009. There is funding through the Fifth Committee for the office, specifically for responsibility to protect. There, I think, is also, if you can see this in recent Security Council resolutions, particular support for the work of the Joint Office. So I think we've seen demonstrable steps forward. On your second point about, so I hope that's answered your question there. On your second point about Sri Lanka, I do believe, and Mr. Dieng may want to add to this, I do believe that the Petrie report, which analyzed independently the performance of the United Nations in that particular case, concluded that there was a failure to respond to the most serious human rights violations and signs of risk in a timely and decisive fashion, and that was the whole impetus for rights up front. I don't think that those concerns were absent from the work of the organization before that. I think what Rights Up Front is trying to do is to much more systematically across the entire organization put the need to look for early warning signs and link that early warning to action by creating new mechanisms in the organization to make that much more systematic. And yes, I think we've all seen, those of us that work in the organization, a demonstrable change, concrete steps that have been taken to act on that imperative, to both get better at early warning and link early warning to early action. I don't know if you want to add on anything on Rights Up Front.
Well, not on Rights Up Front, but I mean, globally speaking, I think one can simply say that the upcoming release of the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights report, of course, is creating some, I would say, tension between the two communities, the Tamil communities and the Sinhalese community. One preferring to have an international, I would say, accountability process, the other one preparing to have a domestic. I mean, at the end, what I can say is simply that we are extremely supportive of any, I would say, inclusive and participatory process for the establishment of a credible accountability mechanism to deal with those atrocities. But I think it is important that any mechanism to be put in place be really commensurate to the international norm, the highest standard for a fair trial. But to my view, what is extremely important, it should be really a priority, is to really strengthen measures aimed to really reconcile the two communities. I think accountability and reconciliation should be the two top priorities of the Sri Lankan government. I have had a meeting with the Chief Minister of the North Province. I've had a meeting with DPR, and I do believe that there is certainly a room to come together for a more inclusive process. I think that is what is needed. I mean, it was important to really identify what happened, and this has been done by the Office of the High Commissioner. And now, I think, let's make sure, let's really support any inclusive process, as I said earlier, which is respectful of the international standards.
Thanks. Thanks very much. And I'd like once more to thank our guests, Adama Dieng and Jennifer Welsh. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon, everyone.